Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network for Entrepreneurs. I'm Dan Hanford, and my wife, Danae, and I interview successful people sharing stories behind tough decisions that they've had to make along their journey as an entrepreneur. On the podcast with us today is Chris Popoff. He is a former petroleum engineer turned full-time founder and investor. Welcome to the podcast with us today, Chris. I'm really looking forward to today's interview.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dan and Danae.
Hi, Chris. We want you to get us started and just kind of tell us and our listeners where your focus is right now as an entrepreneur and business owner.
Absolutely. So I think I've really tumbled into a niche where I sort of define entrepreneurship with a really wide spectrum these days. And for me, what's working very well as an active entrepreneur is to actually acquire existing businesses from retiring owners. It's just got this really nice methodology, and it's a confluence of a few different trends that I don't think will be going away in my lifetime, and if my working lifetime. And if I look back on things when I'm older, say 70 years old, I'll be wondering why I wasn't taking advantage of the fact that there's this big wave of retirements in the baby boomer generation in North America and Europe, and that capital is so easily accessible right now, and things of that nature. So through many trial and error experiments in entrepreneurship and investing, I found that it was actually really just kind of nice to be able to acquire something that's already found a niche, pay a fair price, and keep running it and allow that value to accrue to me. So my focus right now is, after an exit from a similar venture in 2016, I've repartnered with a new group, and we are up to acquiring our next batch of companies. And our goal is to hit $6 million in EBITDA during this career cycle. So I like to look at work and life in cycles, right? All nature has cycles. So I think it makes sense that 7 to 10 years is a good run for any one initiative. And then after about that time frame, it feels right to expand into something that's new, right? You tend to reach plateaus and in terms of your interest and capabilities. And I really enjoy continuing to challenge myself. And this one is about really challenging myself in terms of how to level up as a servant leader and remove myself as kind of the techie entrepreneur that's doing things in the business, and rather working on the processes and building the team and the story around the business, so I could have success at a level very similar to what you two have been fortunate to experience in your journeys.
So I want to clarify something real quick with you, Chris.
Yeah.
So the business that you're in right now, it's a business that you acquired, but is the businesses you're in right now acquiring other businesses, or is the business you're in right now something that you're going to do for the next, like you said, 7 to 10 years and then exit and go to the next business? Yeah,
exactly. That's a good question. So I have my fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak. As you guys know what that's like, being a serial entrepreneur. And so what I've done is I've partnered up with 2 other individuals that I've met along the way and trust and admire their skill sets, and they kind of bring different perspectives than me to hard decisions and how to run businesses and things of that nature. And we are looking to acquire existing companies from retiring owners. And we're actually doing our first closing meeting tomorrow. Believe it or not, we're picking up a small mechanical contracting business together, and we'll leverage that cash flow into other acquisition opportunities.
Okay.
And
so you basically go in and find businesses that are owners that are wanting to exit, and you kind of acquire those and kind of take them to the next level.
Yep. The phrase that's starting to get used in business schools these days is ETA, or entrepreneurship through acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you might have found me through my platform, My First 7, where I try to teach other people about this opportunity and sort of guide and coach them through it.
I want you to talk to us about a tough decision that you've had to make along your journey as an entrepreneur. And I want to start us off with one that I call the sore thumb tough decision, one that really kind of sticks out, and you could probably pick out several lessons that you learned through it. But, when you look back, you're glad you went through it because you did learn a lot through it, but you wouldn't want to do it again if you had to.
Yeah, this was actually really tough to think about when you were priming me for the interview. And I agree with you with the way you frame hard lessons, because I'm actually more grateful for the things that were tough to endure rather than tough to make a decision on action. I find that when you're facing a difficult decision or choice, it sort of frames itself as a dilemma or maybe a trilemma, like you're trying to balance competing interests, and that can prevent you from taking action or making a choice or maybe assuming risk. And so those are tough decisions. But I think in this frame, this question is more like, what decision did I make that ended up taking me down a journey that it was tough to endure?
Right.
But those are quite good. So I'm going to call the sore thumb one in order to be quick. While I was still working as a petroleum engineer, I had an opportunity, and I was an investor actually at that point in time as well, because I really did not enjoy the career and I was kind of looking for an off-ramp, and had started my first acquisition partnership, and it was already kind of running, but it wasn't big enough for me to be able to be employed by it yet. And the company I was working at the time was wrapped up in a joint venture with a major international oil company, like a state-owned oil company. And so it was just brutally slow to do anything. And I was on a project that was kind of third in the line in terms of their priority. So it was like being a ficus plant in the corner collecting dust. It was painful. And I wasn't growing. I wasn't learning. So I had a chance to be able to sit as a director on a startup in the States with a company that was trying to bring out some shale oil in Montana. So I jumped on board, and it was tough because I had to disclose this to my senior executives at the company. And you know that if you're an employee, doing anything like that is like being a prairie dog or a gopher sticking his head above ground. Like you're all of a sudden a target for a combine or a bored farm boy with a rifle, right? Or a coyote. And so those are hard conversations to have. And it was tough to make that decision whether or not I'd be good enough to actually serve this board. I was quite young at the time, and it ended up being a fraud. That the person behind this was actually a Chinese investor that was doing a pump and dump scheme in Asia and trying to get a well kind of reputationed board behind the opportunity, and they ended up getting sued. So it was really tough to go through that and kind of have my name dragged through the mud a little, although there wasn't a ton of consequence. It did teach me how important it is to do your due diligence on who you're getting involved with and to manage your reputation like it's your life, because I do think that that is true.
So I want to talk about this real quick too, because we've talked about partners in the past and how there's a lot of partnerships that go south, and that can be a sore thumb for many entrepreneurs. This is similar to that, but I think it's a little bit different. And I want you to kind of talk to us about what you do now when you start to, quote unquote, do your due diligence, if you will, on a company or a person or something that you're getting ready to move into.
That's a really great question. I think when it comes to partnering, it's a constant challenge in terms of knowing who's going to be a good partner and who's not going to be a good partner. And one of the things that I've learned along the way from just experience and mentor advice would be to make sure that you're not just collecting people that look like you, in the sense of the way you look at problems or make decisions, because your partnership should be able to expand your field of view in terms of how you're examining problems and potential solution sets. And if everybody thinks the same, you're going to miss risks and you're going to miss potential solutions that can steer you, your team, or your company into positions that will be able to outdo the competition or whatever the risk is. So what I like to try to do is make sure that we're aligned on values, personal values, and believe in a lot of the same things and have a similar sort of ethic and moral ethic and ability to speak truthfully, even if it is a difficult conversation. But at the same time, I want to invite partnerships where I'm challenged by the partners, and they'll bring up things that are true that I'm maybe not seeing, whether it's a blind spot about myself or the challenge we're facing. And I find that it's those partnerships that are challenging one another, where we have a common interest in growing as individuals and as a business, and then frequently touch back in with one another on that make the best partners. And anytime there's a red flag kind of in the pit of your stomach that, oh, this person's making a decision that I disagree with fundamentally, it's time to find a way to exit. And so one of the ways that I deal with that is to have the hard conversation up front about what happens if the partnership goes bust, because you can do that while you're still in your honeymoon phase. And definitely
that's very important.
Yeah.
Set those standards and have those discussions before you get into them.
Yeah, whether or not you actually utilize them when you do enter, like, let's say a common set of withdrawing events in shareholder agreements would be, death, divorce, disagreements, things like that. So let's say a partner gets divorced. You have a roadmap in your shareholder agreement that you can follow. But if everything's all still good and everybody's being reasonable, you can still work out a pathway that isn't to the letter of the agreement, provided that everybody's, getting a win-win out of the situation. But you have those things in place to protect you, and you have an escape route built in if you need to utilize it. Going down that pathway is very painful, though, and expensive, which is why I suggest to try to just work things out as good human beings. Because frankly, if you put yourself in the other person's shoes and examine the situation from them, you're going to look at it totally differently. I think one of the questions you had me consider is, what kind of techniques do I use to get through tough decisions? Detachment and reflection and asking great questions is certainly the primary set of tools with that, because most dilemmas usually are not dilemmas. If you ask yourself, who am I being that's preventing me from seeing a solution in this problem? That's a great way to start to unearth some of the underlying assumptions that's holding the dilemma in place, and a great kind of framework to help someone utilize this thinking process is theory of constraints, evaporating cloud thinking process. And it's as applicable to business challenges or business process challenges as it is to interpersonal relationship problems and conflict resolution. So examine the underlying assumptions in anything. It will help you create new solutions to challenges that won't make it as hard, including partnership decisions.
I want you to talk us through another tough decision that you had that had a really good and positive outcome, and some of the lessons you learned through that one.
Yeah, I think this one might actually be the hard decision to actually acquire our first business. I was only, when was that? 2008. So I was 26. I was newly married to my first wife. In order to finance the purchase, we had to sell a condo that we owned together, and her dad had given her kind of a gift to help make a down payment for that. And he was demanding payment because he wanted to buy a boat. It was really stressful. And then eventually, a few years later, when my ex and I got separated, I had to make a decision whether or not to buy her out of her position, because, being my spouse, she owned half of what I owned. And it was a sizable chunk of money at that point in time that I didn't have. I was looking good on paper, but I wasn't liquid. And so I had to take on a bunch of personal debt in order to pay her out and make a bunch of sacrifices in my personal life. And I had to turn down the ability to go deeper on an early stage technology company that I was involved with, that I was on a director's board on. I had to focus on the operating company so I could just pay my ex out on it. And, all the while, a bunch of things that were out of my control were happening, like the economy where I am was really starting to take a hit. That was back in 2008, 2009 was when we acquired it. We were just getting out of a rough patch, obviously, with the financial crisis, but Calgary's in a little bit of a bubble because of its ties to the resource economy. And in 2012, things were really bad up here because natural gas prices had been declining and our fabrication business wasn't doing so hot. And then 2014 was really bad. So I had to get through all of that and let go of things that I really loved, including, personal relationships and opportunities to be part of really exciting high growth technology businesses. And I was always doubting myself and wondering if I had made the right choice. And eventually, even a few years later after that, I ended up getting bought out of that business. Even though I got back to level ground, I finished paying off my ex. I thought things were going good. We were managing the challenges of a hard economy fairly well in the business I was managing for my partnership. And then I got surprised with the talk that the senior partner who owned 50% of our acquisition partnership at the time wanted me gone. So it was kind of a shock. And I had to make a tough decision to fight him on it, because I felt like he was wrong on so many levels, and I had to negotiate against him, the guy who taught me how to negotiate deals. So it was very much a mentor versus a sensei sort of moment, right? Young grasshopper fights sensei, which was crazy. And so do I dig in or do I go with the flow and release? And that ended up being an exceptional outcome for me financially, partnership wise. There were just so many lessons through that tumbling course that I took away. But one was startups aren't the only way to be an entrepreneur, and don't worry about losing out on things. So like the sunk cost fallacy, there's the opportunity cost decision-making model. I like to think of this as FOMO, which is like the fear of missing out, versus phobia, which is the fear of being involved. Just think about the costs of choosing a path or saying yes to too many things, as opposed to just tending to the piece of the garden that you can touch today, which is really, being grateful for what you do have and doing the best with what you've got and in any given moment, and really truly appreciating it. That way you can have a life that's worth living and that you can be satisfied with, rather than feeling bad about all the pathways you didn't take. So there was just so much there. I don't know if you had any more questions on that. But
well, I was just going to ask you, Chris, because you mentioned before a little earlier about, sometimes trudging through the decisions is tougher than just making the decision, the things that we just kind of keep doing day after day. So, how long were you in that phase, if you will, before you kind of realized that, okay, I did the right thing? Did it take a long time? And kind of how did you keep going while you were waiting for things to sort of fall out and fall in place?
Great question. I think that it took me, so if that exit was in 2016, it's taken me almost that entire time today to start feeling really good about things. And my new partners have been very encouraging through this. And I don't think there's any surprise that focusing on my own personal growth and working on some of those gaps in terms of who I am and how mature I am and the way I look at the world has really changed my perspective and how I show up in situations emotionally, and how I interpret things that have happened. As we all know, things can happen to us, but it's not what happens to us that causes an injury. An injury is how we interpret things and the stories we end up telling ourselves, and how we end up preventing future actions and future growth by locking ourselves into those moments of trauma or distress. And so I think by focusing on some of that aspect of my personal development, I've been able to open new pathways and take on new challenges and feel really good about how that all turned out, because honestly, I could really look back on all of that with such deep regret in so many dimensions, rather than focusing on all the good things that came out of it, like how much better both myself and my ex are in our own personal lives. We're both remarried, doing really well with our new partners. We're co-parenting a daughter who's growing up fantastically. We're friends again. Our new partners are kind of becoming friends, which is wonderful outcome. I have such a deeper understanding about who I am and what kind of people I can partner with and what sort of businesses we can excel at. And new opportunities are coming just fast and furious, which is what I wanted. And I think the alternative is I could be really bitter and angry about being rejected and having that break in belonging, and allow that to affect how I enter into new things and new opportunities on a go-forward basis. But I just think taking that sort of toxic position is limiting in the long run. Very, very limiting. But it did take a good year and a half or two, and investing in coaches and counselors and doing a bunch of personally challenging things, and being willing to look at myself and the reality of things from multiple perspectives to get there. Yeah.
A lot of things can happen to us, but we can always be responsible for the energy that we bring to the situation and the way that we look at things. And that can totally change the outcome as well.
Well, that's right. We have one of my favorite kind of philosophers and thinkers of all time is obviously Marcus Aurelius. He was an emperor in Rome, one of the last great philosopher kings, I think he's referred to as. And he wrote a book for himself. It's really just a journal called Meditations, where he talks about how one can essentially rise above the things that happen to them and focus on the things that are within your control, and then to be satisfied with the things you have. And there's a bunch of other authors along this vein. It's called Stoicism, which most people tie that word with a state of low emotion, which is so untrue. Stoicism is about being so deeply tied in and tuned in with your emotions that you see them and experience them fully, but are much more conscious about choosing which emotions to ride and which emotions to pass, and try to interact with the world in a way that you should only focus on the things that are within your control. And one of the things that's within your control is how you emotionally react to things that are happening to you. And to, if something rubs you the wrong way or ticks you off, to look at the situation or the other person with compassion, trying to understand where they're coming from and what kind of battles they're fighting, and to know that's not you and that's not your battle. And you need to conserve your energy for your own battles. And so that's been really, really helpful. And there are a bunch of contemporaries that are kind of resurfacing this way of thinking. Ryan Holiday is wonderful. Tim Ferriss has done a lot of work on reimagining and resurfacing some of the work from like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And it's just wonderful.
We are going to take a quick break and hear from one of our show sponsors. When we come back, we're going to talk to Chris about some of his favorites as it relates to his life as an entrepreneur.
Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HanfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HanfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HanfordCapital.com. All right, we are back. And Chris, I want to go through what we call the trifecta, which is a series of quick questions and answers about some of your favorites in business. So start us off by talking to us about your most favorite technology that you use in business every day that helps make your life easier as an entrepreneur.
It has to be the internet. My life would not be what it is without the internet. I mean, we're speaking through this bizarre, magical network. I mean, it's just, I cannot be grateful enough for what it is. But I mean, logic and thinking processes in general are so helpful in terms of technologies. I like to think of, being able to do math or being able to use the theory of constraints in my business to analyze things in a different way, or any of the mental models that Charlie Munger lays out in his writings as technologies as much as anything. But in terms of helpful kind of modern day tools, I really enjoy the apps like Evernote or Asana in terms to kind of rein in my shiny penny syndrome, which is being distracted by anything kind of new and interesting. I'm just so curious. But if I can vent that by capturing in Evernote and then going back to it, once or twice a year and saying, okay, what new ideas do I actually want to integrate instead of being distracted? And then Asana is a really great sort of task management tool for teams that I'm using to great effect these days.
Chris, what is a favorite quote that you've heard that has helped you as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I heard this one pretty early, actually, in a poem by Sarah McMain called For My Daughter. And I think it's actually quoting the original writer was Clementine Paddleford. But and it's kind of funny because I'm a dude, but the quote is, "Never grow a wishbone, daughter, where your backbone ought to be." And I mean, the whole poem For My Daughter is wonderful. And especially because I have a daughter, it's really important to me. But I think it's advice that's as valuable regardless of what gender you are. It basically says, if you've got a desire to do something, you need to be courageous and have a backbone and actually move towards it instead of wishing and hoping that it will come true. And that's been so powerful for me as an entrepreneur.
And what about a favorite book that you've read?
Just one. I'm constantly reading. Yeah. Well, I've already kind of mentioned Ellie Goldratt, Theory of Constraints. That book was kind of introduced to the world, was called The Goal. I mentioned Charlie Munger, Poor Charlie's Almanac, but some other really important books would be the autobiography of Jim Pattison called Jimmy. That's where we learned how to do vendor take back, to do acquisitions. And then I really enjoy Morimoto Musashi's Book of Five Elements and his short poem, The Dokodo, which is the way of walking alone. It just helps me look at the world from a totally different perspective and practice those skills of detachment from ego to look at the world as it is.
So what's the next thing for you right now, Chris, that's on your vision or on your dream board?
Definitely growing Agincourt's holdings to $6 million in EBITDA and focus on growing as a servant leader and father and expanding my stomping grounds or my range to include Vancouver, the West Coast, or Seattle.
Sure. That's awesome. So how can the listeners reach out to you after they've listened to this episode and they want to kind of, follow you more or get in touch with you?
Well, they can definitely check out my podcast and my blog at myfirst7.com. The email address there is engage@myfirst7.com, and I'll get right back to you. I'm constantly looking to help others who want to pursue the entrepreneurship through acquisition pathway as an operator, or people who are looking to invest in people like that. We've got some cool products that we're working on, a kind of a course to teach people about this. And if they want to, after taking the course, actually take action, I mentor small batches of groups. I've got 2 people closing transactions right now under that model. And we're hoping to build a kind of a proprietary database of battle-tested opportunities with real metrics, and do so by essentially being each other's advisors and potential partners. So we do it all under the protection of a non-disclosure agreement and honesty and reciprocity, and the goal of serving one another by helping ourselves. Yeah, so I guess I call that pathway the move from dependence to independence to healthy interdependence.
And we'll make sure that any of the links that you mentioned and any of the books and stuff like that are put on the show notes. And for those of you who are listening, you can visit toughdecisions.net to get those show notes. Thank you so much, Chris, for taking some time out of your schedule to be with us today. Look forward to having you on our podcast again in the future as you continue to grow as an entrepreneur.
It was an absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email, where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.